Welcome to Addis Ababa. Salam እንኳን ደህና መጣችሁ. For those of you who are visiting us from Africa and across the world, I want to welcome you to my home, Ethiopia. Having the opportunity to deliver this keynote here at home is particularly meaningful to me. I was born and raised in Adama, just over an hour drive from here. Growing up in Ethiopia shaped many of the values and ideas that continue to guide my life and work today. Ideas about community, collective responsibility, and the understanding that our well-being is deeply connected to the well-being of others. This gathering has brought together many people who care deeply about one question. How do we create lasting change? How do we create lasting change? And before we go any further, I would like to recognize the entire EAPN team, especially Purity and David that I'd worked with over the past weeks getting ready. In a sector that often talks about collaboration, EAPN has created a space for us to actually practice it, to learn from one another, to challenge one another, to build relationships and imagine what is possible together. So please join me in giving a round of applause for the entire EAPN team. I think a louder one, they really deserve it. Yesterday, we explored the challenging capital landscape. We examined where resources are coming from, how funding flows are shifting, and what a post-aid future may require of us. We know the landscape has changed. New actors are entering the ecosystem, new mechanisms are emerging, and new resources of capital are taking shape. So today, I want to ask a different question. What infrastructure does this new capital require? Or are we building the institutions capable of carrying the future this capital can create? Because capital alone does not create change, although there's so much emphasis on capital always. And what determines whether capital successfully makes impact is infrastructure. The systems, frameworks, operating models, trust mechanisms, and institutions that allow resources to move responsibly and effectively. But even that is not enough. Capital alone cannot create change. It needs you, the change makers in this room. For me, the goal of building that infrastructure is to ultimately achieve self-determination. When I think about self-determination in the context of our field, I think about communities having the power to define their priorities, direct their resources, and shape their own futures. And like Brian said in his electric keynote yesterday, self-determination should be about wealth creation and not poverty alleviation. I think about Africa's future being determined by Africans, not in isolation or in silos, but through relationships built on dignity, trust, and mutual responsibility. That understanding also shapes my philosophy of giving. In many institutional settings, giving is treated as a transaction. Resources move from one place to another, metrics are standardized, and accountability flows only in one direction. But that is not how I learned the principles of philanthropy. In Ethiopia, giving is a part of daily life. Giving is about strengthening the collective. Everyone gives, whether it's money, wisdom, time, or labor. In our homes growing up, our moms prepare extra food every day, expecting that someone might stop by for lunch. That's not a family member. There is a deep tradition of collective responsibility that reminds us that infrastructure is not only institutional, it's also social. And what fascinates me about these traditions is that they don't diminish resources, they actually multiply them. And sometimes I get frustrated because we speak as though Western philanthropy has invented giving. But giving has always existed within our communities. And people are not waiting to be saved. They are not waiting for funders to finish their next strategy session. They're already organizing, adopting, supporting one another, and building solutions. And given that we're here in Ethiopia, I think I can probably mention the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam as an example of nobody's waiting for somebody to come and save them. So how do we build infrastructure that strengthens what already works? And how do we ensure systems enhance existing community assets rather than replacing them? The team at EAPN had asked me to say a little bit about my own story, so I want to share with you that growing up, my parents understood that education changes what is possible. I was very lucky that both my parents were college graduates, which is a significant privilege to be grown in a home of educated parents that have opened the doors for me. But every day I crossed between two very different worlds. I lived in a neighborhood shaped by poverty and entered classrooms filled with opportunities many of my neighbors would never experience. At school, my friends talked about university, and back home, my friends were dropping out of school. At the time, I didn't have the language for structural inequality, but I knew something was wrong. Years later, in 2008, I founded Seeds of Africa, an education and community development organization. And like many African-led organizations, we started small with an after-school program in my mom's backyard. We had no sophisticated institutional framework, just the belief that the families we hoped to serve, would guide us on what the community needed. And they told us they needed a full-time school for their children and microloans for businesses for the moms. And that's exactly what we did. Now, fast forward 18 years later, the first class of students that entered our kindergarten are finishing their first year in university this year. This is proof that the people closest to the challenge were also closest to the solution. The community did not need someone to arrive and tell them what they needed. They already knew what they needed. What they needed was the resources to act on that knowledge. But as Seeds grew, I encountered another lesson. The hardest part of my work as a leader was securing transformative funding. And when I talked to funders, the conversations often felt disconnected from the realities that we were trying to address. The questions were rarely about what the families were saying or what their experiences were. Instead, the questions focused on whether our systems look familiar, whether our reporting structures matched their expectations, and whether our organization resembled models people already understood. Looking back, I realized that those conversations were not really about impact. They were about infrastructure. We were navigating systems that had been designed somewhere else, often by people who had never experienced or sat inside the classroom that we were trying to build. So over time, I came to understand that money matters, but well-designed infrastructure determines whether money can actually make impact. We're having this conversation about infrastructure deficit in philanthropy at a really remarkable moment. Across the continent, organizations are navigating shrinking aid flows, shifting donor priorities, changing geopolitical realities. We often hear that philanthropy is becoming more collaborative, and in some ways, that's true. We are seeing more networks emerge. We're hearing more conversations about trust-based philanthropy. More people are speaking about community-led development, participatory approaches, partnership, and shared power. But are we really seeing deeper collaboration, or are we seeing more conversation about collaboration? Because when we open the hood and look underneath, many of the systems and processes used by funding institutions are not catching up to the values they say they hold. We say we value trust. We say we value local leadership. We say we value self-determination. But too often, the systems through which the decisions are made, resources are distributed, and accountability is measured were designed for a different era and different set of assumptions. Many of these systems were inherited from colonial practices and hierarchical models of control. And when systems fail to evolve with the times, we find ourselves reproducing the very outcomes that we're trying to avoid. Which brings me to accountability. Too often, accountability only flows in one direction. It just follows the money. Organizations are accountable to funders, then to the boards. The boards are accountable to regulators. But where are communities in that chain? Who are we ultimately accountable to? What would happen if accountability flowed in multiple directions? What would happen if communities could organize and have their own accountable mechanisms? If organizations could hold funders accountable? And if funders were accountable not only to what they fund, but to how they fund? Meaningful structural change in philanthropy requires looking inward. It requires funders to examine their own systems and processes and ask whether they're truly aligned with the values they say they have. At the same time, we should be careful to not confuse innovation with progress. New infrastructure is not ultimately better infrastructure. As we build new systems, we must continuously ask whether we are truly creating something different or whether we're repeating the same mistakes in a different form. The question is not whether standards matter. The question is who gets to define them, whether the standards we use reflect the values of self-determination other than dependency. One of the gifts, the greatest gifts in my career has been the opportunity to build the African Collaborative and to have had the experience from both sides, first as a founder and now as a funder. I've gotten this rare opportunity to test a hypothesis for structural change by scaling the ability of local leaders to help shape the systems and resources that move through and see what it looks like when communities have voice in philanthropic governance. This idea that people closest to the challenge are also closest to the solution is not just a philosophy. It's how we think about building infrastructure itself. That's what we do at the African Collaborative. We're building critical infrastructure that connects capacity directly to communities, that connects capital directly to leaders. We partner with institutional funders and individual philanthropists to move unrestricted multi-year capital to African-led, African-founded, and African-based organizations. We've spent the last 6 years building the systems, the team, and equity-centered processes required to make sure our vision becomes a reality. We have learned through this journey that it's good infrastructure creates freedom, it reduces duplication, accelerates learning, lowers transaction costs, enables trust, and ultimately creates conditions for organizations and communities to thrive, for an ecosystem change to happen. By the end of today, you would have asked and answered one question. What kind of institutional architecture is required for the next generation of capital to achieve this full potential? As this morning's opening plenary explored the architecture taking shape between capital and impact, it was great to examine the collaborative vehicles, pooled governance models, and systems required to transform a collection of funding instruments into functioning infrastructure capable of supporting long-term sustainable development. After the tea break, the agenda will move to analysis and application. And there will be one work stream that focuses on institutional floor. The second explores on how philanthropy, government, civil society, and private sector actors can work together to finance, govern, and facilitate collective action. The third stream asks a fundamental question: who sustains the infrastructure between funders and communities? And then this afternoon, all the master classes will provide practical tools for all of you. But before you go into all the rest of the day number 2, I hope to remind you that we're ultimately here to figure out these infrastructures because they are vehicles for self-determination. They're mechanisms for communities, for our communities to shape their own futures. They are the bridge between resources and possibility. They are the infrastructure between capital and impact. Throughout the day, a common theme will emerge. The future of philanthropy will depend not only how much capital is available, but on investing on shared resources and infrastructure that benefits the ecosystem as a whole and delivers outcomes that no single institution could hold alone. The future of philanthropy has to create wealth not alleviate poverty. Thank you, and welcome to day 2.